Back to Daniel. In Daniel 6 today. Hebrews 11:1 defines faith as the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. Unfortunately, the word hope is most often used as a synonym for wish. And so it ends up changing the meaning of this definition into a wishful jump off a cliff, leap off a cliff, and hoping you'll land okay. And that's not so. There is no leaping off a cliff with biblical faith. Faith is a conviction of truth that brings about an assurance of an eventual outcome. It's a confident assurance of what is to come. Not a wish, no blind leap in any sense. Solidly built on the evidence of the character of God and his ability to keep his promises. Faith is simply stepping forward, trusting God according to his promises. That's really all it is. And that's why it's a walk of faith. Every step you take is based simply on a fact. God has made promises. He's told us how to live. I will walk according that way, trusting him. Knowing that the outcome, whatever it will be, is in his hands. And that his ways are better than my ways, even if it means suffering. You may recall that when we were studying Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, their statement to the king was a very simple one. Our God is able to protect us from this fire, but if he chooses not to, we will still not bow down to your false god. That's a walk of faith. It wasn't dependent upon a particular outcome. It was dependent upon we know our God, we know what he's like, we know his character, and that our lives are in his hands, and our purpose of our lives are bound in him and his glory. Now, there are many things that are going to occur in life that will test your faith. In fact, we are told in James 1, 2 through 4, to expect, in fact, to consider it all joy, my brethren, when various trials, these testings your faith come upon you, because they do test your faith. And that testing of your faith is going to produce endurance. And it's going to end up with its perfect work in the patience of coming to a perfect, complete maturity, lacking in nothing. And that's what the testing does for us. It enables us to mature. Now, as various situations arise in your life, then your belief and trust in God is challenged. That's the test of faith. And as you go through each one, you become a more mature individual. Your faith actually in God, your trust of him, keeps increasing because he demonstrates his faithfulness to you. Now, this morning, we're going to be examining the example of a solid faith exhibited in the life of Daniel. This is probably one of my favorite stories in Scriptures, and maybe among yours as well. Daniel in the lion's den. Often that it seems like it's shortened down to something simple, and there is a simple truth in it, but this is a marvelous story and one that is needed for us in our own time. Now, it's doubtful that here in the United States that your faith is going to be tested in the same way as Daniel's was. You're not going to be threatened to be thrown into a den of lions. Your life probably will not be threatened, though that does occur. But the extreme of this testing actually occurs quite often among our brothers and sisters in other lands. They're in areas that are extremely hostile to the gospel and coming to faith in Christ, professing that faith, and especially if you do something like what Sarah did, you get baptized, you could be marked for death and martyrdom. So we can be tested. Now, that persecution isn't here at that level yet. It could come. And so we need to be ready for whenever any kind of testing comes. Because the simple reality is this: if you cannot stand firm in testing of your faith that's light affliction, how will you stand when it's severe? We learn from Daniel the example that we are to follow and how God does enable us to become stronger to withstand anything that may come against us. Now, before we begin our study of Daniel 6, we need to identify Darius, who is mentioned there in the first verse. He was introduced at the end of chapter 5, verse 31, after the Medo-Persian army had captured Babylon and had killed King Belshazzar. That very night that Daniel had interpreted the writing on the wall was the night that Belshazzar died. Babylon is captured. Verse 31 then says, Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Daniel 9, verse 1 identifies Darius as the son of Ahasuerus, of the lineage of the Medes, who was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans. This is what we know about him. Now, the specific identity of this man in ancient literature becomes a little more uncertain. We know this, but there's not a lot in the ancient record that has survived that gives us more precise information. And so various names and terms are at that time interchanged without clarity, and so it becomes a little more confusing. And then we have the problem of ancient languages. It's hard enough to translate something in another language, right? Hebrew is not an easy language for English speakers. It's structured different, and it's a whole different mindset, as well as these gutturals where you spit on everything. You know, I don't know how else you can say it. It's sort of like German. You know, I don't know if you've heard that adage, is the French speak, the Italians sing, and the Germans spit. How do you translate these things, and especially when it's an ancient language that's not used anymore? So there can be difficulty here. And because of that uncertainty, and our only existing use of the term is here, Darius the Mede, in ancient literature, is just here in Daniel, then liberal scholars scoff. They claim Daniel was an error. This is evidence it wasn't written by Daniel. It must have been written sometime later, an impostor in the 2nd century, and he's mistaking his historical references, and this must be Darius Hystaspes, or Darius the First, except he wasn't born until 522 BC. That's 17 years after the fall of Babylon. However, there's a lot of possibilities here. I want to give you two. The first one, well, it's in a lot of literature. I don't think it has much to stand on myself. But the first is that this might be a reference not to Darius Hystaspes, since he had a different father. He comes from a different ethnic background, and he lived in a different time period. But instead that it might be Cyrus. Cyrus is king, and some translations of Daniel, the reference in Bel and the Dragon, which is in the Apocrypha, refer to this man here, Darius the Mede, as Cyrus. Daniel 6:28 could even be translated as even instead of and. And so the verse becomes a bit of a question. Is referring to two persons or one person. The difficulty with Cyrus being the identity of Darius the Mede is Cyrus is of Persian descent, not Median. He's the son of Cambyses the first, not Ahasuerus. And so he's a different person. Not only that, at the end of Daniel 6, it makes it clear that he's talking about two different people. I've always been a little intrigued that liberal scholars would want to say that this might be somebody else and Daniel was false. If you were living closer in time to the event, your knowledge of it would be better. So if you're writing in the 2nd century, your knowledge of Persian and Median history would be such that you wouldn't make such a mistake. In addition, when it went before the translators and copyists, they would not have accepted Daniel as a book of Scripture inspired by God if it had that mistake in it. So, who is this? Well, the reasonable identity for Darius the Mede is a man called Gubaru. 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 In the Nabonidus Chronicles, it's stated that he was made governor over Babylon under Cyrus, which is exactly the position Darius the Mede has. A little confusion, because in those chronicles there's also mentioned a man named Ugbaru, and he is the governor over a place called Gutium. In an earlier translation, both Gubaru and Ugbaru are referred to as Gubrias. In favor of this view is the fact that Darius received the kingdom, which means the position he has is something he gained from a higher authority. Second, Daniel 9:1 states he was made over king of the Chaldeans, that specific area, specific people, not over the whole realm. And then third, as we've already seen in Daniel 5, the term king has been used for lesser authorities. So Darius the Mede is referring to this fellow Gubaru, who was the governor over the province of Babylon, referred to as king here. So that's who we're talking about, a real individual living at a real time with authority. Look at Daniel 6, verse 1. It seemed good to Darius that he set 120 satraps over the kingdom, and they would be in charge of the whole kingdom, and over them 3 commissioners, of whom Daniel was one, that these satraps might be accountable to them, and that the king might not suffer loss. Then this Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and the satraps, because an extraordinary spirit was in him, and the king planned to set him over the entire kingdom. Now, we're not told how long after the fall of Babylon that this occurs, but it would not have been very long. It's not uncommon for a conquering nation to appoint from among the officials of the previous nation officials for their own nation, as long as there's some loyalty demonstrated on their part to the new king. That would be the issue. Those who had already been in those positions know how the kingdom works. They know how the structures already work. They know the people. They know the culture. They know the customs. They know all those things. So if you can tap into those, and they're going to be loyal to you, they'll enable you to govern much more effectively. And that's what Darius is looking for. And so he has set people over, and Daniel would certainly have been a prime person for this, because he's already been in a position of a high authority within Babylon for over 60 years. He knows the people. Now, it also means he's elderly, so he's not going to be spry and able to do as much, but his wisdom is there. And he wants to tap into that. And it doesn't take long for him to start recognizing, just like Nebuchadnezzar had 6 decades earlier, that there was extraordinary wisdom in Daniel. This is a man that will be useful for the good of the kingdom. Now, Daniel also would certainly fit the qualifications, since his rebuke and prophecy against Belshazzar would have been made known. And so Darius would know that his loyalty wasn't to Babylon, it was to his God. And he was loyal, and had been demonstrated to be loyal to those over him. He was a faithful servant to the government that he was under. Now, Darius is the authority over the province of Babylon. Under him, he appoints these 120 satraps, also translated as princes. They're lower officials, but they are over regions and affairs of the province. They have specific responsibilities. And over these 120, there are 3 commissioners or chiefs to oversee them. And as Darius became more familiar with them, he started seeing among these 3, Daniel has the more excellent spirit. Obvious, he's far superior than these other 2. And so he considers setting him over the whole realm, and he's planning to do so. But you can immediately see what response is going to be there. It's going to be a jealousy on the part of the other 2. We don't want this guy over us. Maybe one of us should be it, or we should at least maintain equality here. We don't want this Daniel in this position. There's jealousy there. Verse 4. Then the commissioners and the satraps began seeking to find a ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to matters of the kingdom. But they were not able to find any ground of accusation or evidence of corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful, and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. Then these men said, "We will not find any ground of accusation against this Daniel unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God." So first they formed this conspiracy. We've got to find a way to get rid of Daniel. They don't want him in authority over them. And there are a multitude of possible reasons for that, ranging from just basic jealousy to also racial prejudice. Remember, they're Chaldeans. Daniel is a Jew. And that's going to come out a little later. In addition, they probably want to hide their own corruption. If we can stay in position of power, we can continue to hide it. Oh, if only our own governments would have people like Daniel in charge, rather than like these other two commissioners who seem to be there mostly to, how do we hide our own corruption? We need more Daniels. Well, whatever the reasons, they begin by examining all the details of his work. And what do they find? They can't find anything. There is no corruption. There's no negligence. Everything that he is put in charge of is done well. So there is no fault. Now, how can we remove him the king's favor if we can't find a problem? And then they figure it's going to have to be something regarding his God. If he's faithful to his God, if we can find something there to be against it or create something, then maybe we can cause his downfall. No direct conflict between their own law and the law of God, so they can't find anything there. What are they left with? Well, they're going to have to create a law that will create a conflict. That's the next conspiracy. Look at verse 6. Then these commissioners, satraps, came by agreement to the king and thus said to him, King Darius, live forever. All the commissioners, the kingdom, the prefects, the satraps, the high officials, the governors had counseled together that the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who seeks to make a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the written document so that it may not be changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked. Therefore, King Darius signed the written document, that is, the injunction. Well, they set out to manipulate the king, institute a law that's going to get Daniel into trouble. And they were successful. Darius was easily swayed by their fawning over him. While the greeting of King Darius, live forever, that was a common court greeting, the rest of it was all designed to use Darius's pride to manipulate him. Proverbs 29:5 warns, a man flatters his neighbor, spreads a net for his feet. The flattery is to catch you, to entrap you. And they ensnared King Darius. First, they come in a large group. And the claim here is that everyone in the government, from governors down to the captains, they all agreed about what should happen. Well, that's a lie because no one consulted Daniel. In addition, it's highly doubtful they had consulted everybody else either. But truth is of little concern to those who are plotting to do evil, is it? So we'll just make the claim. Second, they manipulated Darius by inflating his ego. It was not that unusual for Persian kings to be thought of as having attributes of deity. And so this plays into his pride, to be thought of in these kinds of terms. The restriction of giving petitions to Darius alone is not so much considering him to be a god that could answer the prayer himself, but rather he is the human representative of the god or gods, and he would have supreme authority to mediate between the god or gods and man for 30 days. And so the prayers would have to be made in Darius's name. Now that would be also seen as a supreme act of loyalty to Darius. So you can see why Darius would be swayed. His pride and also getting more loyalty. He gives into it, he takes the bait, he signs the decree, and it becomes the law of the realm. Now the text emphasizes here the fact that the law of the Medes and Persians could not be changed once it's enacted. The penalty for making a petition to any god or any other man other than Darius then is to result in execution by being thrown into a den of lions. Now, envy and jealousy are common sinful ailments of mankind. All of us struggle with it at times. We've all had it. Someone is doing better and we become envious of their position or jealous of it. We'd like to have it for ourselves. Now, if that is something that just drives you on to strive to be better yourself, that could be used for something good. Most of the time, it's how can we bring the other person down so we can be equal to each other. That is just plain sinful. this jealousy, envy, they lead to all sorts of other sins. And here it's trying to find an accusation against the righteous. Now, this is nothing new. It's old then, it continues today. Jesus even warned that such evil people will make up things. They will lie about you. They will slander you because you're striving to walk in righteousness. That's part of the Sermon on the Mount, right? Blessed are you when that happens to you. In this case, they craft a law to make it illegal to do what is righteous. And evil people still do the same today. The lead in our own society. That'd be government, education, entertainment, media, big business. They've become well known now for calling what is evil good and what is good as evil. And they work hard to try to change our society to comply with their degenerate sense of ethics. And they've been very successful at it. Now, there are, of course, many perverted laws which are designed to promote evil and punish righteousness. We are living in this. The last legal protections for marriage were removed decades ago. You may not really realize that. No-fault divorce is now the law in every state, not by federal decree, but by each state giving their own version with it. A little interesting fact of history, New York was the first to pass such a law and the last to finalize one. First and last here in this state. Began it and then finalized it in its current form. Remember, these laws are created by lawyers for their own benefit. Okay? That probably tells you about all you need to know about them. What has ended up happening is lawyers get rich because they seek to create more turmoil. regardless of what the particular test is that you may be facing. Look at verse 10. Now when Daniel knew that the written document was signed, he entered his house. Now his roof chamber, he had windows open toward Jerusalem. And he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, giving thanks before his God, as he had been doing previously. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel seeking to make a petition and making supplication before his God. Now Daniel knew what the law was. He knew that it had been signed. He also knew of the possible consequences for his actions. But he did not vary anything that he was doing. Now, he could have tried to comply. I just won't pray at all for these 30 days. Or maybe he could have tried to hide it. He'll change his practices of prayer, maybe switching to only very early in the morning or late at night and no one would notice. Or maybe at least he could have closed the windows, right? That would be pretty practical, right? Close the windows. Daniel simply chose something very simple. I will remain faithful to the practices I have always followed. Now, among the many instructions given in Jeremiah 29 by the prophet were the commands for those in captivity to call upon the Lord and pray to him with the promise that he would listen. If you go back into the dedication of the temple, there was in Solomon's prayer of dedication is that if the people who were remote would pray toward the temple, that God would listen, even if they can't be there physically. Daniel is simply doing what he's always been done in accordance with the instructions he had received. Now, we know that Daniel had the instructions of Jeremiah. When we get to Daniel 9, this is the very section he was reading for it. And chronologically, Daniel 9 comes before all these events. So we know he's familiar with Jeremiah. He's simply doing what he's always done in accordance with the Scriptures. This custom of praying toward Jerusalem, as I mentioned, dedication of Solomon's temple, it's 2 Chronicles 6:34 through 39. That's where that came from. How about praying at morning, evening, and noon? Well, that's actually the example David set forth and wrote about in Psalm 55. Daniel would have been very busy with many government duties entrusted to him, and yet he consistently took time to pray at those times. This was his manner of life. He's now in his 80s. He's been doing this a long time. His position of kneeling, well, that's simply an act of his own humility before God, and it is the example that is given in Psalm 95:6. Now, Daniel's actions described here then are not done in some obstinate manner. He's not seeking martyrdom. That would be true if he changed his normal practice to make his prayers more obvious. Instead of being in his room, he went out in public or something. That would be a quest for martyrdom or being obstinate. He simply is doing what he has always done. He's firm in his faith. He continues his righteous conduct. Now that's the example all of us should follow. It's right there. He established himself in living righteously. What should we do? Well, we should be spending our lives in establishing ourselves in living righteously. And as the years go on, our pattern of life should become more and more righteous, right? That's simply aspects of maturity as we draw closer to the Lord. And as those patterns are established, those are the things that help keep us on track. It's part of spiritual disciplines. And so, because of this, he simply doesn't waver from these practices, regardless of whatever laws are passed, and the same thing has to be true for us. Our practices of righteousness before God come first, because our loyalty is to God first. That's where Daniel's loyalty lies, and he's already proven that in the past. The loyalty is to God. And so he doesn't change regardless of whatever sinful things are practiced by those around him, whatever thing goes on in society, whatever perverse laws make it more difficult to walk in holiness, whatever persecution arises, he simply is going to continue his normal practices of walking in righteousness. That's it. Now, these evil men were already aware of Daniel's routine, and as soon as they passed the law, they set out watchers. We're going to catch Daniel violating this new edict. But that's exactly why they had it passed, specifically to catch Daniel. And, of course, they did not have to wait long for their plan to be achieving its desired goals. If he's praying morning, noon, and evening, all they have to do is go catch him at the very next time of prayer, which is what they did. Now they have a basis for accusing him. Verse 12. Then they came near and said before the king concerning the king's injunction, "Did you not sign an injunction that any man who seeks to make a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days, is to be cast into the lion's den?" The king answered and said, "The word is certain according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked." Then they answered and said before the king, "Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the injunction which you have signed, but keeps seeking to make his petition 3 times a day." Then as soon as the king heard this word, he was greatly distressed within himself, and he set his mind on saving Daniel. And even until sunset, he kept exerting himself to deliver him. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, "Know, O king, that is the law of the Medes and Persians, that no injunction or statute which the king establishes may be changed." Now the they in verse 12 here refers to the 2 commissioners along with some of the satraps that had come to Darius to inquire about the law he had signed. This would not be all the government officials, their leaders, that they claimed to have consulted back in verse 7. Most of them would not have known the reason for this law at all, if they knew about it at all. When Darius confirmed the law, they accused Daniel of violating it, of ignoring it. Now, they make no reference to Daniel's position in government, but they do specifically point out that Daniel's ethnic heritage. He is from the Jewish exiles. He is from the people we conquered. The effort here is to be derogatory to him. Now, Darius immediately recognizes that he has fallen into a trap, and he has signed a very foolish law. Now, for the rest of the day, the king tries to find a way to excuse Daniel from the penalty of the new law, but to no avail. He can't find one. Now, the fact that he's worked at this, I'm assuming that it's either the morning prayer or the midday prayer is what they caught him in, because he's working at least all afternoon trying, before sunset, trying to find, there's got to be some way I can abrogate this thing, find a way around it. Well, evening comes, the conspirators return, remind the king the law could not be changed, and the penalty for its violation had to be carried out, and so Darius is left without an option. Verse 16. Then the king said the word, and Daniel was brought in and cast into the lion's den. The king answered and said to Daniel, "Your God, whom you constantly serve, will himself save you." And a stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring, and with the signet rings of his nobles, so that nothing could be changed in regard to Daniel. Now, Darius' reaction here is fascinating once remembered he would have only known Daniel a short time. And yet here he already had developed such a deep loyalty to him. Even more remarkable, he has some basic understanding of Daniel's faith and Daniel's God. He gave the order for Daniel to be cast in the lion's den, but he also expressed his own confidence that the God that Daniel served would deliver him. Now, it's doubtful Darius would have believed the God of Daniel to be the supreme and only God, but he did understand that Daniel's God was faithful to Daniel. He would have known something of the history by this time. He would recognize Daniel was pious and faithful, and so he does believe that Daniel's God would rescue him because of that faithfulness. Now, we don't know the exact physical layout of this lion's den, but if it's like others have been found in the area, it would have been a large pit in the ground with a partition wall and a gate between the wall. That would enable the lion keepers to move the lions from side to side to carry out their duties. Surrounding this pit would be a wall, 4 to 5 feet high, that would restrict access to people going to the pit or stumbling into the pit. It also then would have a place where a stone would be rolled as a gate. So it would be placed there for access for the lions coming out, put lions in, the lion keepers, and all the rest. The mouth of the den is then blocked by this stone gate. And then the king and the nobles seal it with their signet ring. A wax seal is put over it, and their signet rings are impressed into it. So if the stone is moved, the wax will break, and they'll know somebody has violated it. Someone has entered in. What this tells us is that the nobles don't trust the king, and the king doesn't trust the nobles. The nobles are fearful the king will come and get him out of there, and the king would be fearful the nobles will come in and kill him while he's in there because they want him dead. They don't trust each other. So the signet rings, nobody enters. The king's concern for Daniel then is expressed by his activities the rest of the night. Look at verse 18. Then the king went off to his palace and spent the night fasting. No entertainment was brought before him, and his sleep fled from him. Now, entertainment and eating would have been a normal part of the king's life, but this night he will have none of it. Instead, Darius spends the night fasting and without sleep. Again, this stresses the importance that Daniel was to him. Look at verse 19. Then the king arose at dawn, at the break of day, and hurriedly went to the lion's den. When he had come near the den to Daniel, he cried out with a troubled voice. The king answered and said to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to save you from the lions? So as soon as it's light, the king hurries over to the lion's den. He needs to find out what happened. Now, the stone doesn't have to be removed for him to call in for Daniel to answer. So he calls out, says in a troubled or lamentable voice, why? He's uncertain of the outcome. He was optimistic that Daniel's God would save him, but he's not certain. So the king's question places the emphasis on the God that Daniel served and whether he had preserved Daniel. Notice that he even recognizes that Daniel's God is the living God. That means he expresses an even greater understanding. Perhaps Daniel had talked to the king Darius about his God and how the true God differs from the pagan gods that Darius would have served. Maybe told him about the stories, or others had told him about the stories of Daniel and his friends, Hananiah, Azariah, Mishael. And so he would have known something more about it. His desire, had God delivered Daniel from the lions? Verse 21. Then Daniel spoke to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths. They have not harmed me, inasmuch as I was found innocent before him. And also toward you, O king, I have done no harm. Then the king was greatly pleased and said to Daniel to be taken up out of the den. And so Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no harm whatsoever was found on him because he had believed in his God. Now I'm sure Daniel's voice was very pleasant for the king to hear. And Daniel gave Darius the customary salutation, and then he explained God's intervention. The Lord had sent an angel. The angel was the intervention and had shut the lions' mouths. Now, Daniel's enemies had accused Daniel of doing harm, of violating the law. Daniel here says no harm was done to him because he was innocent. Notice as well that Daniel adds here, he committed no crime against the king either. Again, his accuser said directly, Daniel was not paying attention to the king's decree or the king. He disobeyed this new law. But Daniel had committed no crime. Why? Well, because society can make up whatever laws it wants, and because it has the police power to enforce those laws, it can make life very miserable. But all laws must eventually be judged by God's standard, and any law of man that contradicts God's law is void. There is no crime except that of the society using its police power to punish righteousness. They have violated God's laws. They're the guilty ones, and God will judge them. But in obeying God, you remain innocent. You may be punished by society, but you remain innocent before God, and there's only one courtroom that really counts in the end, isn't it? And that's God's courtroom. So at the king's command, Daniel is taken up out of the lion's den and examined. Indeed, there is no injury to him at all. Nothing. He remained firm in his faith in all circumstances, and now Darius has plans for Daniel's accusers. Look at verse 24. The king then said the word, and they brought those men who had brought the charges against Daniel, and they cast them, their children, their wives, into the lion's den, and they had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Now Darius knew that he could not trust officials such as these, and so he carried out a just retribution. Deuteronomy 19, 16 through 21 speaks about the just punishment for those who accuse others. And the just punishment is to have that sentence carried out on them that they sought to have carried out on an innocent party. In this case, it's to be cast in the den of lions. Now that seems harsh to our Western sensitivities to have the whole family cast in with them, but such was the common practice of the ancient world because it removed the possibility of relatives, progeny, later on carrying out retribution against the king. They're all dead. There's been times God has carried this out as well. Korah's rebellion, Numbers 16, is all of the family gets swallowed up by the earth. You might recall this story. In the rebellion, Moses tells them to separate from Korah. He's with his tents, his whole family, and Moses says, if a new thing happens, then you'll know this is God's judgment. The earth will open up and swallow them, and that's exactly what happened. Now, this would not have been all the officials claimed to have been consulted when the charge was brought in the king in verse 7. These are the ringleaders who'd come with the accusations. The fact that those cast in were overpowered by the lions before they reached bottom of the den proves the miracle of God preserving Daniel in the midst of very hungry and very ferocious lions. These aren't circus lions. They're not tame. Darius then makes a decree. Look at verse 25. Then Darius the king wrote to all the peoples, nations, and men of every tongue who are inhabiting all the land, may your peace abound. I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom, men are to fear and be in dread before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and enduring forever, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed, and his dominion will be unto the end. He saves and delivers and does signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has also saved Daniel from the power of the lions. So Darius's decree here is similar to the one that Nebuchadnezzar had made back in Daniel 4. It's written to everyone as a proclamation of what God had done in rescuing Daniel from the lions. It also includes a command that those under his authority, those within his realm, are to give reverence here, actually fear and trembling to the God of Daniel because of that God's attributes, because of God's activities. Darius now recognizes the God of Daniel is distinguished from the pantheon of gods of his pagan system. The God of Daniel is the living God. He is the eternal God, and he has an eternal kingdom that cannot be destroyed. That's quite an admission for a pagan, isn't it? He also admits and recognizes this is the God that intervenes into the affairs of men. He delivers, he rescues, he performs signs and wonders, even as he did in rescuing Daniel from the lions. The chapter concludes with a short note about what happens to Daniel afterward, verse 28. So this Daniel enjoyed success in the kingdom of Darius and the kingdom of Cyrus, the Persian. And so he did. Quite success when you consider he's in his 80s and still serving in such capacity. God had equipped him there as well. For the remainder of Daniel's life, he serves the kings of the Medo-Persian Empire that had conquered Babylon. The ability to be firm in faith is not something that suddenly arises in a moment of testing. It arises from faithfulness in walking with God in daily life. Whatever your habits are, undergirds your faithfulness in the future. Those that consistently strive to live in holiness and practice righteousness simply continue to do so on a higher level when they face a trial. And the more severe the trial, it's simply a higher level of trust. I will trust God to be faithful to his own character and to his promises. But those that yield to the temptation and the pressure of the world when tested in minor things are going to be more likely to yield when the severity of the trial increases. So the testing of faith is always from the small to the larger. So whatever you may be going through now, it is a matter of walking in faithfulness with him. Will you be able to stand firm in your faith like Daniel, Hananiah, Azariah, Mishael? You will if you're striving to stand firm now in the relatively minor challenge to your belief and trust in God. If you're struggling with that now, then you need to improve, set the basic disciplines of walking with God as a foremost thing you need to get a handle on. Daily time in prayer, daily time in his word, daily time in serving him. A mindset that thinks of God first. A mindset that seeks to put first his kingdom and righteousness before the things of this world. A mindset that says it's much better to sacrifice the things the world says are good for the things of God. As that is done, then you continue to grow. Now, obviously, we need help, but that's what the body of Christ is for, isn't it? That's what Ephesians 4 tells us. That's what 1 Corinthians 12 tells us as well. We are put together in a body, each one with whatever particular gifts we have, that we will help one another grow in faith and strengthen each other so that we can walk as we ought to walk. We ought to help the weak. We do admonish the unruly. We're patient with all men, and we help. That's what the body does. There are things to get involved with. There's men's and ladies' Bible studies. They'll be starting up in September. The Kids Adventure Club starts up October. Those are things that we do. There's also personal discipleship. If you haven't had that, then talk with Diane for the ladies. Talk to Ed Cologne. We'll have someone come alongside you. Personally go over the basics of what it means to walk with Christ. Lay a foundation and then just keep building on that. And then no matter what happens, you are strengthened to be able to deal with the testing of faith. You see, you can dare to be a Daniel as you learn to stand firm in your faith. Because really it comes down to a matter, I need to know God better, and I need to learn to trust him in all things. Father, thank you for the truth of your word. And Father, for this great example in Daniel and his friends in earlier chapters. And thank you for your long-suffering patience with us as well. That as we learn to be faithful in the small things, we become better able to be faithful in the larger things. Setting aside our own desires for your desires for our life. Setting aside the things that we think will give us satisfaction in life to finding that satisfaction really comes when it's related to walking with you in righteousness, in holiness, our lives reflecting Christ in our life. Father, it grows as we learn to love one another as Jesus Christ has loved us. And so all men will know we are disciples by that very love. Continue to have that in this congregation, growing. And Father, then extending out from it. Father, our desire is to see you worshiped, honored, given praise by all people, knowing it begins with those who call upon your name. It begins with us. Thank you for your Holy Spirit's work to continue to prod us this way and empower us to live it. In Jesus' name, amen.